Thank you so much, Becky, for having me and for letting me open with some poetry and artificial intelligence. So, my name is Lauren Ducrey. I'm a poet, an author, an AI designer, and a string cheese enthusiast. And I say that because I recently stepped away from an unlimited trove of string cheese when I recently left Google after 7 years spent there designing the personalities of different virtual entities like the Google Assistant and Gemini. But what I am now on a mission on is to make both poetry and AI tools for us to develop our emotional intelligence. So happy to jump into that with you all now. So when I was a adolescent growing up in France, I made the very passionate decision to study literature. And I will let you guess what the number one question people asked me was. I'll let you mull that over in your mind. Well, the question was, what are you going to do with a degree in literature? Well, fast forward a good 15 years, and I find myself a poet working on the bleeding edge of one of the biggest technological revolutions of my generation, large language models, these models that we know under the name of ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot. And I'm going to assume that many people in the room have either used these tools or are familiar with them, but kind of to come back to basics, they are super powerful statistic models, and they're very good at predicting the next word in a sentence. So it is very likely that you might say the sky is blue. It is less likely that you would say the sky is clear because the weather changes. And it is very unlikely that you'd say the sky is smiling, although arguably the most poetic of the three options, which already starts to tell us something about poetry. Now, there are vast implications to the fact that these models exist and that they can produce large amounts of text in what we call natural language, which is the language that we all use day in, day out, which is a stark contrast with the binary code that so far underwrote most of our technology. What I would like to focus on is how this new wave of AI is an unexpected invitation for us to reclaim our emotion and our imagination as the core of what makes us human. And that is because since the Renaissance, at least, we have decided that what makes us human, what distinguishes us from other species, is the ability for rational cognitive reasoning, right? I think, therefore I am. And so we've honed these cognitive abilities above everything else. And nowadays, we even hear ourselves or other folks refer to our intelligence, to our mind, to our brains as supercomputers. But in 2023, something happened. ChatGPT was launched to the broader public, and we realized that these models were much better than us at analyzing large amounts of data systematically. We realized that some of the qualities that we took to be essentially human weren't that unique to us at all. But there's a second but in this reasoning. As we see AI challenging parts of our cognitive abilities, we also hear more and more voices reclaiming our emotional sensitivity as the token of our humanity. There we go. And there's already significant research that shows that our decision-making processes, our behaviors, tend to be more determined by our emotions than they are by our reason, that actually functions more as a sort of explanatory mechanism, a sort of PR person, if you will, once we've already made these decisions. And so who are the experts of our emotional sensitivity? Poets, writers, and artists. And in my opinion, poetry is an absolutely irreplaceable science of the human experience. Right? Its laboratory is everyday, and its awesome messiness. And its tool, its stethoscope, its microscope is something that we all use every day. Natural language, the same stuff that this new wave of AI is made out of. Again, I did not expect to find myself a student of literature, a student of natural language at this intersection of tech and the matter of poetry itself. And sorry, skipping ahead for a second here. Not only are poets and writers experts in natural language, sorry, not only are they experts in our emotional intelligence, they're also experts in language, right? In the stuff that these new AI are made of. And that double ability to appreciate emotion and linguistic abilities is exactly what tech companies need right now. Because the more we develop, the more we model natural language, the more we realize how complex it is. And poets know this. The whole point of poetry is to play with the expressive potential of language, to decode it, and to re-encode it in the form of poems. And this double mastery of emotional sensitivity and language is very dear to me because there are already AI applications that make use of it. And so I'm going to share a few examples of AI tools, of large language-based tools that use both language and emotion or emotional intelligence to help us develop our ability to communicate more empathetically. So examples about how AI can help us be better communicators. The first example that I would like to share with you is an example from my former team at Google. I was on the team in charge of developing, here we go, of developing the personality of the Google Assistant, like I mentioned. Now, what does that mean? When you interact with a virtual assistant, you basically ask three types of questions. You might ask for information. What is string cheese actually cheese? What is the capital of France? You might ask for an action, play music, turn on the lights if you have connected objects. And you might also ask what we called personality queries, things like, are you a robot? Do you have feelings? Tells me a story, tell me a joke. And we would have trends of the most asked questions on the assistant. And during COVID, one of my coworkers noticed a new trend of question, or actually I might even say confession. She noticed that people were saying things like, I'm sad, I'm lonely, I'm scared. Obviously a reflection of the reality that we were all going through. And so we partnered with researchers in psychology and clinicians to develop a content strategy to appropriately respond to those confessions or questions in a way that didn't stray into giving medical or therapeutic advice, because of course that is not what the Google Assistant is meant to be. And so a question for you all, if you imagined yourself telling a virtual assistant, maybe the Google Assistant, maybe another one, I'm sad, which option would you prefer to receive in response? Option A, I'm sorry you're sad. I hope you feel better soon. Option B, thanks for sharing that with me. Being honest about your feelings is a big step. Or option C, sadness is a common emotion. Feeling down or unhappy in response to grief, discouragement, or disappointment is normal. If ongoing, this may indicate depression. So I'm curious, maybe we can do this in the chat. And can I see the chat? I can see the chat. What response would folks prefer to have? Option A, option B, or option C? If you were to say, I'm sad to the assistant. And we'll just say just a gut reaction, saying some B's, some A's, more A, some C, more B's, B with a question mark, very fair answer. More B. Well, the strategy that we decided to go with the team was, drum roll, if my slide will cooperate with me, option B. And the reason for that was based on best practices from the clinicians that we were working with and research The reason behind this was that the most important thing that we found was the need to validate the person's emotional experience in that moment with something like, thanks for sharing that with me. Being honest about your feelings is a big step, which also allowed us to not make any interpretations because we have very little context about the quality of the sadness. Maybe it's this momentary passing sadness. Maybe the person said sad, but what they were actually experiencing is grief. So just validating the emotion was the most important thing for us to do. And then we get into offering solutions or steps forward, but always in a very open-ended way. Hence this added response that we wrote, which is, I've been learning about ways to cope with sadness. Would you like to hear one? Because sometimes people don't want a solution necessarily. They just want to get that reflection and that validation. And so we tested out this strategy, and it was so well received by users that we rolled it out in 30 different countries in 30 different languages. But beyond being a model of empathetic communication, I think AI can also provide a space for us to practice our empathetic communication skills. And that is basically what Home Team proposes. Home Team is a product that I got to work in as UX lead in partnership with Google and a brilliant social impact startup called Reflex AI. And Home Team was developed for and in partnership with US veterans to allow them to have more supportive conversations about mental health. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with US veterans, why veterans as the population that we were working with? Well, because of this disquieting statistic, which is, well, first of all, 68% of vets don't plan to seek mental health due to stigma-related concerns. Stigma is really a massive barrier to mental health care. And even more troublesome, veterans are 1.5 times more likely to die by suicide than non-veterans. And the opportunity that the team identified is this one. We found out that 92% of veterans report wanting to help peers with their mental health, but only 25% feel equipped to do so. And that gap is what we set out to bridge by designing Home Team as an educational program that equips veterans with very practical communication skills to have impactful conversations about their mental health. And so learners go through different modules. Ooh, sorry, I thought I had a little screenshot to show you of the modules. They go through different modules to learn, again, very practical skills, things like active listening, asking open-ended questions, how to address suicide very directly, all based on best practices from, again, clinicians. And the AI magic happens at the end of every module, because at the end of every module, the learners then get to practice the skills that they just went over with a virtual character that plays the role of a veteran in need of support. So you could think of this as a flight simulator for conversations, right? And you also get feedback on how you're doing in using those skills in quote unquote real time in the simulation. And I want to pause to really highlight how much of a game-changing use of AI this is. Because what Home Team is doing is completely flipping the script from AI being a provider of support. We know there are therapy chatbots that are out there, right, that play the role of an existing human job, a therapist. It flips the script from AI being a provider of support to AI being an enabler of support for us to have better conversations in our everyday life. In this case, veterans, but I think that there's a way to, or there's use cases beyond the veteran population where we could all imagine improving our communication skills. And so I have a question for you. What difficult conversation would you have tomorrow if you knew you could practice having it in a low-risk environment? And I really invite you to take just a second to think about that. And maybe there's a conversation you know you have to have in the next week, maybe even today. And how would that change your approach of it if you knew that you could practice having it? I think this application is incredibly powerful because of this beautiful quote by the emotions researcher Brene Brown, who writes that language is the greatest tool for meaningful connection, and having access to the right words changes everything. And I think that actually both AI and poetry, which can both seem daunting and unapproachable, can be incredibly powerful for us to find the right words. And we could find the right words again in many different contexts, whether professionally, you could imagine improving your communication at work with your managee or manager. You could even imagine improving your communication in your personal life, with a partner or with friends who have different political views or different values in general. But I've spoken a lot about the power of language, and I would be remiss if I only told you about it without showing you. So I would like to close with a short poem of my own that is called When We Go. And one day, the community of madness that are the voices inside your head will become so loud. They will push you with all their hands and bring tears through your eyes until you very nearly forget that you can hold yourself. Until you very nearly forget that this net of thought is desperate to catch your ocean of unstoppable emotion. And that this net of thought feels so true because you precisely made it to keep reality from view. And it will rope you into a place where you can't remember that your body has got your back. Your body has got your back. So sit up, sit straight, take a breath and feel yourself. Feel yourself with the same strong, soft touch as your mother, friend, or lover. Invite them under your skin until you warm with a familiar feeling of their faces and embraces. And you realize that your body is a home, because anyone who's ever moved you still lives inside. Until one day, the community of madness that are the voices inside your head becomes a loud invitation to summon the community of kindness that are the voices of your people instead. Thank you so much. An honor to open this day of inspiration. I would love to stay in touch with folks because there's obviously so much more to be said about this intersection of poetry, AI, and empathetic communication. So would love to stay connected with everyone. Thank you for the lovely comments in the chat. And I think we can open it up to questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren. That was really beautiful. And for those who joined a little bit later in, I definitely check out the recording once it's up, because the full spectrum of what she spoke about, from tech, AI, poetry, humanity, it really, you took us and stretched us in many places. So I think there's so many people in this room that I will only very briefly actually just make one remark, but then open it up to everyone. I think it's just too good of an opportunity. I know a lot of people with different backgrounds. This is amazing. We've got regulation, we've got cybersecurity, we've got artists, poets, we've got everything. So yeah, my only thing that I'd like to add quickly is the cloud reference. So the cloud is smiling. That really was just lovely. And having a data point beside that, as a data scientist, it's like, I can see it in both ways. And one of my things is data representativeness. So that means if you don't have access to the language of the culture or the group, you can't even start that conversation with AI. So for me, it's hip hop, it's street poetry, and this is being completely missed. So yeah, I just want to promote diverse natural language, that it's yeah, we need more of that and more funding to support that. But yeah, I'm going to mute myself and just offer to anyone who wants to jump in and ask a question. I hope we can just do this casually without hands or anything. But yeah, jump in, anyone.
Or if you feel more comfortable dropping it in the chat as well, you can definitely read through that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Anna. This is tremendously interesting. If you want to expand on any of the points that you made, Lauren, just while people are thinking, because it's quite a lot. You took us in so many different directions.
I mean, on the point that you just made, I was at a conference last week and somebody asked the very valid question of how models are being trained on different languages. And it tends to go through English. And I obviously, when I was at Google, I was first in charge of developing the French language version of the Google Assistant. So I was on a very international team, and all our work was doing not just translation, but what we called transcreation, which is really translating the emotional tenor and the cultural intent underneath what the English American assistant would respond. And at that time, there was obviously investment. We were a whole team, right, of people from these different cultures and languages. And I don't know what the status is today, but it does kind of worry me that we're going through English and translating English, for instance, into French to give the French response of a Gemini or a ChatGPT. And I haven't cracked the code to how to, I mean, I know from my experience with the Google Assistant that when we brought that cultural touch, we definitely saw an increase in our different metrics. And I'm just hoping that companies don't bypass that, because it seems like a learning that we keep on learning over and over again. But then when we get in these strong developmental phases, there's kind of this shortcut of like, oh, we'll just go to English, translate English directly in that language. But I can't see that as a sustainable long-term solution if you want these products to be helpful worldwide.
Yeah, that's really interesting when you talk about how do we measure culture, how do we measure language, and again, people jump in, but I'll just keep going with it as an open discussion. When we looked at hip hop lyrics across decades, and we combined the artists and yeah, all their songs, and the word broke was going up and then down and up. And it mapped to recessions, and we were able to show that the word broke literally kind of mapped to poverty rates from census data. So for me, that's my attempt to create an evidence base. And it wasn't just the word broke, actually, it was also the word suicide. So there's this interaction between money and mental health during recessions, which is obvious, but using lyrics and words, street poetry, I found that was an effective way to get the message through to people who might not, they need evidence in hard numbers as opposed to just trusting the intervention or trusting that the words can be medicine, the words are powerful. So it's a challenge, but can you describe a little bit more about, you said there's metrics about you saw an increase when you actually looked at culture.
Yeah, we didn't get as granular as I would have loved to, but we basically had a metric that was customer satisfaction, where it was a grade out of 5 points. So you get a random survey at any point of your interaction with the assistant, and some of you might have experienced this, saying, how much did you enjoy that response from 1 to 5? And that was our main metric. And we would see on the international team, we would tweak, or we would test, A/B test different content strategies, some being, more explicitly, let's say, francophone versus a more literal translation of what already existed in English, and we would see definitely a higher or more positive feedback on what was more directly localized to our markets. We explored other metrics that I found really interesting, things like emotional trust and product love, that I think would have gotten us even closer, because one thing that was really hard to judge was humor. We had a whole corpus of jokes, and it's really hard to know when somebody dislikes a joke. Is it because it's like a dad joke, and it's kind of like a groan, and that's why they're giving us a 1 out of 5? And that just becomes, I think, really difficult to measure. At least from my experience, I haven't seen a metric that captures the appreciation of humor in a quantitative way.
That's fascinating because even in the little promo DIMH teaser, I put comedy in there. But there's definitely, I'm glad you put that out as an actual thing. So we've got some questions here. And let's go to start with Paul. Thank you, Paul. So feel free to jump in if you want to speak to ask your question, but I'll just read it out loud as well. Where do you usually start with a poem? And where does AI enter the process? I love that.
Great question. I have learned to take this one quote very literally, and it's taken me a long time. There's this quote by the French poet Jean Cocteau who says, "The poet doesn't invent, he listens." And I remember seeing that the first time and thinking it was very inspiring, but I kind of thought the listening was more metaphorical, this invitation to observe the world, to be in contemplation. And more recently, I realized that when I literally stop doing things, and I sit down and I sit in silence and close my eyes, there are words that are present. They're kind of jumbled with thoughts and distractions, but there's a certain voice that, again, it feels very just everyday like, but I'm starting to notice that it's actually more poetic. So I'll sit down, actually listen. Sometimes I don't necessarily need to sit down and be in complete contemplation. I'll be, walking around somewhere and I see something and I kind of hear that voice starting to give me a few of the first words. And so I've given myself allowance to be way more spontaneous in my writing. And so I'll whip out my phone and start taking notes and try to kind of hold that thread delicately, because if I try to write too much, then my thinking voice kind of comes and overlays the more poetic voice. So it's definitely a balancing act. So the beginning of the process is very organic and just actually listening in that way. I will use AI in a pretty lightweight way compared to there are other AI poets that, it's like from start to finish. I use it as a kind of thesaurus on steroids, meaning that I'll ask it to give me a list of words to describe a certain, like give me 20 words that would help describe the color of blue when the sky is right before sunset. And I can give it all this added context that you obviously can't give a Google search or a thesaurus. And I'll start playing like that and start to expand my vocabulary. Um, so that's been I would say the number one use that I have of AI with poetry so far, but I do have ideas of translating poems into other media thanks to AI. And I think to me that is one of the most exciting creative uses. Or an idea I had was, what if I could translate a poem into different species of flowers that don't exist? And essentially, what I would be doing there is defining, okay, let's say that stanzas represent the size and shape of the petals. And then I would say, okay, a 4-line stanza, they're big, broad petals. 3-line stanzas, slightly less broad. And let's say 2-line stanzas, they're even like thinner. And you kind of create this lexicon or this matrix of what parts of the poem look like in terms of the flower, and then use that to prompt a model like Midjourney or any image type of model. And you could imagine automating that so that people could type in their own poems, and then boom, they get their own unique poetic plant generated. And that type of translation, you can imagine that with music, you can imagine that with film, obviously. That's what I find exciting. Or in reverse, what if you could translate a picture into a poem? Again, the idea is to tell the model, okay, if I give you a picture of a rose because it's this color and the petals are this size, that translate into a non-rhyming poem with 3-line stanzas. So just throwing those ideas out there.
That's great. Thanks, Lauren. So this question up next is, let me just scroll back up to it. Okay, so it kind of segues back to where we were talking about fitting like natural language for the right group of people that you want to engage with. And I'll just make one point to bridge that. Where conversational agents or chatbots use the kind of foundational model or the language that they can pull off the internet, often Western, and you can compare that as a evidence base to when the language is a different language. And there's research out there showing that, English versus Spanish, and when the participant uses both or transitions, you can look at the metrics that show, have they engaged more? Are they enjoying it more in their native language, kind of thing? So again, just a thought about evidence. So, but to segue into Colin's point, so can AI be trained specifically on groups of people? Is this what you did with the veterans? I'm thinking in line with Becky's thoughts on focusing on language used for specific groups, young people, slang, and so on. So, Colin, if you want to speak at any point, just jump in. But yeah, over to you, Lauren.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And like Becky mentioned, most of the models that we use today, there's like a base training, right? That's going to be on a bunch of the most available data on the internet, typically North American English. But then you'd fine tune the model, which is what we did with the project with Home Team. So I think the base model was ChatGPT. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's what it was. And then you fine tune it with an extra layer of very curated data. And in this case, we organized role play conversations with veterans. So it wasn't obviously actual conversations with veterans in crisis, because you can imagine it's impossible to capture those conversations, and it would be completely, ethically wrong to somehow capture that. So we did role play, but the idea was to capture just the natural language that veterans would use when they played the role of a veteran in crisis, imagining moments in their own life or conversations that they had with friends. So that's one way in the mental health space that you can gather data ethically to train bots, because it's obviously a highly regulated space, and it is difficult to get training data for that reason, and particularly in conversation. So role play is one of the ways to do that. Outside of mental health, it can be easier. And that's one way to think about how to train different chatbots. If you think of existing content that's out there, when we were training Gemini, Google's model, one of the examples my coworker always gave was, if you want to make it talk like a pirate, it actually does it quite well, because it just turns out there are lots of pieces of content out there that are pieces of fiction that with a pirate speaking. So you can think of what are the types of language that might be already represented. Can you lean into that? And if not, then you need to generate your training data set to have that representation that Becky, you were talking about. How do we give digital representation to types of language and vernacular that typically don't exist in the digital world? And do we want that as well? There might be instances where we don't want to inscribe certain traditions or certain types of language in the digital sphere.
That's really great. We've got a couple more questions in the chat, and I'll jump to one that relates to this and then come back to Mark and over to you, Kathleen. So Karen says, does that mean, sorry, my little emoji things is blocking it, that the learner at the end of each module are also providing the data to train the AI? And if so, are they aware of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will give the caveat that I'm not like a safety and policy expert. I was on the design side of things, so I just want to give expertise where expertise is due. I believe that in this case, the home team was going to go with a very safe use of the data, where usually in the terms and conditions, it's explained. Do we read the terms and conditions? I don't know about you. I usually don't really read them that much, but that the data wasn't going to be kept for very long at all. That's the extent of my knowledge. It's not a very satisfying answer, but I think it's a very important question to have, and one that we were also asking a lot at Google. Beyond terms and conditions, I don't know that companies tend to give more explanations than that.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. I'm going to take us in a different direction now with Mark's question. And this is Mark's a co-founder of the lab with me, and we've been playing around with visuals, asking it to produce brainwaves and creativity, and it's kind of frightening. Actually, it's extremely frightening. Some of the images we don't want to share with people because it's just painful. And I used a visual example because I wanted to keep words in a positive light. So Mark's question, great talk, first of all. How does the AI avoid making generalizations in making a poem? Does it avoid using cliche or repetition? So kind of the dad joke stuff, but yeah, go
Yeah.
for it.
I would say it doesn't, but it can. So it doesn't because it's a statistical model. So if you prompt it in a very general way, like if you say just write a poem, it's going to be full of cliches and repetitions because it's just going to go towards that, the average poem. And that's the difficulty of working with AI as a creative tool. Now, obviously, you can get really into prompting, right? What's now called prompt engineering, and you give it all these sets of instructions to avoid cliche and repetition. It can be, giving it instructions on, I want the poem to have these elements, but also giving it examples of poems that avoid cliche and repetition. And one other use that I found brilliant that this is not my idea, but again, at this conference, a professor in France basically suggested because they're statistical, why not lean into the bias? And so he started to develop, not necessarily for creativity, this was more for use cases with companies. He started to create what he called like diabolical models, where it's basically models where he cranked up the bias. And of course, the point wasn't to use the output of that, but to use it as this, like, this is what we don't want to do. And I really like that use of leaning into the inherent creative flaw in the fact that they aren't very creative or they're not very original, and have that as this kind of counterpoint for us to better brainstorm and for us to steer clear of the patterns. And I think that is what I've seen, in the advertising industry. There's a lot of use of AI, and they often use it to analyze, like, what are the patterns that mean that car advertising is like win competitions. I think what's interesting is not to like, let's reproduce all those traits, but almost now that we have the patterns, we can step away from them with more awareness because we're also biased and we also tend to go towards patterns we've seen. So using AI almost as a counterexample is something that excites me.
That's really
Thank you.
interesting. Oh, sorry,
Yeah.
Mark, go ahead. Go
I
ahead.
I was going to say that's really interesting. I was looking at AI this morning, just looking at writing a song lyric, and it's just
Mm.
appalling. It's like really, really bad, and it's like this generic kind of use of of just really cheesy kind of thing. So, do you envisage that AI will actually just look at diabolical models and say we don't want this, and then suddenly get more and more into being more creative? You think that will happen?
Can you say that again? The diabolical model will.
So using a diabolical model as a basis for what we don't like in creativity, do you think that will drive creativity in AI to some extent
I
by
think
using that model?
I think it can drive our creativity. You could imagine a world where you create a diabolical model and have it converse with a more vanilla model and see how it pushes the vanilla model further away from its, statistical bias. I think there's kind of wild scenarios like that. But I'd more thought of it in terms of how can the model just spur our own creativity as humans, like our own creativity almost offline.
That's really encouraging to hear because I think with AI, people are using it as kind of a crutch to just use it for, I'll make a song go, I'll make a million or whatever. And I think this is a
Yeah.
good way of using AI, I think, just to spark your own creativity. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
just to
cool.
to add to that, I think, and I totally understand the concern of, like, are we watering down art and creativity? And I think certainly there's this democratization of, you can generate images and songs. And in a way, I think that could be really fun. Is that going to make great art? I think no, it's going to make very easily accessible average art that might be fine for cranking out a fun song. Somebody gave me this example. They made a song for their kid's birthday. Great, fun. Why not? To make that hit song, I think the people who are going to be able to use the model the best are people who are already musicians because they know how to prompt a music model to play the right instrument in the right tone in the right way with the right, they have the vocabulary to actually prompt the model appropriately. I was teaching a class on filmmaking at Columbia University. I'm not a filmmaker, but I can, teach people how to use models as a brainstorming partner. And then when they got to the image section, which I'm not a specialist of Midjourney or one way or whatnot, but it was very obvious that to create a storyboard, for instance, you need to have the vocabulary of frames, of camera movement, of the type of lighting you need. And the people who are going to know that are filmmakers, no one else. I mean, you can learn that, but any artist already has a leg up in their use of AI as a creative tool because they have the vocabulary to prompt it.
That's amazing. And this tying that in with the diabolical model, which sounds so scary, but useful in its own way. On the flip side, an artist, well, we're working with a rapper who is keen to create a model of himself.
Mm.
But again, it's all about data. You need a lot of data. So you have to rely on other data that's not him. And it becomes this kind of issue of what is this representation? And it could be positive or negative, but he also wants to add other rappers. So could he have the voice of his 10 top favorite rappers? And you could translate that into poetry, like a personalized thing where your 10 favorite poets, you start looking at that information. But the ethics of that gets really complicated quickly. I don't know if you want to comment on that. And then we've got a couple questions in the chat, which I'll jump to after that.
I mean, what you make me think of is something that I haven't seen that many conversations about, but there's something about this AI that can almost let emerge this voice of the multiplicity, right? Which is kind of what it's doing anyway. It's already kind of like taking all the language out there and averaging it out, quote unquote. And that to me feels exciting and a step out of the individualistic paradigm of creativity, where I understand why artists need to have rights to, have a livelihood. And at the same time, as creatives, we all know that we're never really doing any of our work alone, right? I am just a filter of all the influences that I've had in my life. And it seems like AI could actually actualize that in a very real way, where you could just input a bunch of data from different creative sources and generate a piece in a way that is the voice of a collective. And that I do not have the answer of how to do that ethically, but there's something interesting about really being able to actualize almost this creative commons with AI.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. So Chris from Australia. Okay, good stuff. There are a number of digital mental health providers in Australia in the early stages of AI implementation to augment their existing apps, platforms, and tools. What one piece of design advice would you recommend to promote greater trust among consumers to better engage with these services?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And then we've got a follow-up comment from
Yeah.
Colin, just while you're thinking. Chris, I hope you don't mind me asking, but are any of those around youth mental health? Australia is usually ahead of the curve for youth mental health.
So my
I'm going to
answer,
stay off. I'm going to stay off camera, guys. But yeah, it's so wonderful to join DIMH for the 2024 edition. Yeah, so I mean, one of the key themes for us in Australia at the moment is thinking about how we foster trust in not only digital mental health tools, but also in artificial intelligence, and how we sort of break down some of those barriers and some of those myths around AI being dangerous and you know, kind of a bit of a data sucking machine. So I'm just interested, from your experience with Google and, from a UX UI perspective, if there's any kind of design elements that might feed into creating a better and more trusting environment.
yeah, I mean, my experience is biased towards conversational AI, which I realize might not be the UX of all, mental health providers. But I can give you an example, a very specific example of how we dealt with that in Home Team, which might spark inspiration. So we did a lot of user research, leading testers through going through the modules, and then they, interacted, or they had they viewed a screenshot of the chat room, and we asked them, what they thought of this, et cetera, et cetera. First of all, not all of them understood that it was AI. So there was a balance to strike between the honesty of them not thinking it was an actual human, because that happened a lot. And I think that is a risk around some AI, I mean, particularly conversational AI, because it can just sound really human. So making it clear that it's not human, but also not scaring them with the whole AI thing. And I think it's not it's not a lie to speak to people in a language that they know and that they understand. And so what we did is that we chose a very character forward design, where you go through the module and then there's a screen that says, you're now going to engage with a virtual character. So drawing from the world of gaming, which is actually quite accurate and close to what we were designing. But it's also suggesting this is not a real entity, and it's made with tech. Do they need to know that it's a large language model? That doesn't really make a difference in terms of their user value, right? Whether it was hard coded or made with an LLM doesn't make that much of a difference. So we presented this character. You're going to interact with a virtual character that has a name, that has a backstory. And so then they're like, okay, I understand. Not a real human. This is a virtual entity like a game. And then they could enter that experience understanding the framework, and they would seamlessly go into it, have these conversations, and exit. And I think that was, it's a very specific example, but that's one way, being very borrowing from other paradigms that exist for us character.
That's so cool, Lauren. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So we've got only a few minutes remaining. I just wanted to ask about, you mentioned expanding your vocabulary, which I thought was really interesting from a protective factor for mental health as well. So language and things like verbal dexterity, and there's a ton of different things you can measure just to take someone on a journey of shifting their vocab. So do you see that being a creative tool in any way, where words are presented, synonyms, or other creative ways to inspire people to grow their language? And is there space for mental health interventions to be studied?
So sorry, I zoned out for half a second. So you're saying, are there spaces to
kind of,
our vocabulary?
yeah, so basically words is medicine. So can we help people build their vocab, like through poetry? Just, it makes perfect sense. It seems there's a lot of opportunity to offer words. People are very hungry to take on additional things. So just wondered your thoughts on how you could go about doing that to support language.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just thinking of poetry alone without even involving AI, I think poetry gets a rap of using very complicated language, and that can be true. But I think a lot of my favorite contemporary poets actually use everyday language, but the way they use it is different and original. And so I think it sheds a new light on words that you might use every day. And suddenly you see them anew, and that sparks that curiosity. And I think it starts to um, allow us to get a little bit more curious about the language we use, even if we use it in very simple ways. So I think there's that approachability is actually something that is very essential to poetry. And when I think of bringing AI into the fold, you can actually ask it to get very granular in describing a variety of emotions, which is usually different from humans. If you ask us how we're doing, right, we'll respond with the same like 5 answers. I'm fine, I'm okay, I'm tired, I'm sad, I'm good. Like that's pretty much it. But one of my coworkers at Google was working on making the voice of Gemini, and even the assistant before that, more emotionally in tune. And he would actually ask Gemini to kind of rate what the voice sounded like and then give it a description. And the descriptions were just incredibly rich. So these models, like I was saying, they can kind of function as thesauruses or dictionaries on steroids, because they just have so much of that language at the tip of their fingers that, again, most of us aren't going to go read a dictionary or thesaurus, but because of the conversational nature, it's easier to have a conversation with ChatGPT or a Gemini and ask them to describe even what is the emotionality of a poem. That's something that I do. I actually have a prompt where I ask it to engage in conversation with myself to unpack a poem. And it's really, really fun because it will kind of prompt me forward. It'll give me some comments and feedback, but it'll really spur me to think about, what is this poem saying? How is it saying it? And then it'll add, again, some more granular vocabulary about the emotionality of a poem. So it was a bit of a roundabout response, but
No, it was great. It was really informative. And I suppose you could do the opposite, where you could have prosody and intonation. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. So you could have this bi-directional forms, that and that kind of thing.